Link's Awakening was a 1993 black and white Game Boy game re-released 5 years later in color for the Game Boy Color. It's hard not to think of that conversion as a linear improvement. The original version necessitated a lot of white space and lighter grays for the sake of readability, and didn't really communicate the idea that were this world seen in color, it would have been vibrant and varied. The DX version is vastly more colorful and lively, even with the very limited number of colors which the Game Boy Color could actually display at once. The animations were very simplistic, and the player traversed the world screen by screen between perfectly square areas, but probably the most damaging aesthetic aspect of the game is how the tiles which comprise the world's floor are also perfect squares with no ability to smoothly transition into one another, in the way that tiles could do in the previous game, A Link to the Past for the Super Nintendo. All of this and the very low resolution, meaning a lack of detail in the character sprites especially, are reasons that another visual update to Koholint Island is justifiable, as are gameplay updates such as allowing you to equip more than 2 items at once so you don't have to open the menu constantly. Wait, hold on, they didn't change that? Well then what the fuck was the point? Link's Awakening for the Switch fills a very different role from DX in that it doesn't just add to the detail in a linear sense, but massively overhauls the entire aesthetic of the game. Adding more detail to a game's visuals almost definitionally means making it less abstract. The number of stylization options open to a designer working in HD are also exponentially greater. While it's safe to assume that a lot of older games with simplistic visuals were meant to abstractly represent something which would have ideally been as photorealistic as possible, it's a lot more difficult to imagine how something more deliberately stylized would be translated into higher resolution, especially if the stylization had been crafted specifically around the limitations of the system they were crafted for. In the case of Link's Awakening, being as it was intended as a direct sequel to A Link to the Past, the aesthetic seems to be a somewhat simplified and more abstract version of that game's art style. Ocarina of Time, meanwhile, which was the first translation of Zelda into 3D, doesn't seem to be a linear translation of the art from any of the previous 4 games, but its own interpretation of the same kind of general tone and context. Nevertheless, if we consider the progression from the first game to A Link to the Past to Ocarina of Time, a lot of gamers most likely thought of these games as more or less being the same thing but with better graphics. This obviously changed with the Wind Waker, and from that point forward, Nintendo would make experimentation with the art style a staple of the series. Additionally, in the same way that Link's Awakening represented a simplified version of A Link to the Past visually, games like Four Swords and the Minish Cap on the GBA combined the graphical style of A Link to the Past with the color aesthetic and character design of the Wind Waker. Phantom Hourglass, meanwhile, represents something more like a linear downshift of Wind Waker's graphics to a top-down game, without as much influence from the old ones. So when it comes to remaking Link's Awakening on the Switch, the options are practically infinite. Does it make more sense to copy the style of A Link Between Worlds, which was also presented as a sequel to A Link to the Past, even though that game also transformed the overall aesthetic of its predecessor in its own transformation to 3D graphics? Apparently not, as Nintendo ended up opting to do something completely new. Link's Awakening on the Switch has this very uniquely shiny and smooth style, resembling lacquered wood. It feels like an old handcrafted playset, and with limitations lifted on screen real estate and scrolling, Link is now relatively centered on the screen instead of moving through square tiles, at least on the overworld. Characters are no longer unemotive due to a lack of available pixels for facial detail, but because of a deliberate decision to give them all black eyes, contributing possibly the most to the impression of the characters as old toys. This stylistic shift represents by far the biggest departure of a Zelda remake or sequel from its original form. Whereas it might have been possible on the Game Boy to imagine that what you were playing was simply an abstract representation of something more realistic, or at least something that could translate to a more detailed representation of the same art style, the remake is actually one of the most photorealistic games in the series, in that it resembles a realistic depiction of a playset. This art style leaves little to the imagination. We are not tricked into thinking that this world is an abstract representation of something more realistic, but instead convinced that this is the natural look of the setting. In light of this, certain design elements carried over from DX take on a very different feeling. For instance, in DX, each screen in the town contains just a single building, and the little bit of time that it takes to transition between them, as well as the fact that you'll never see more than the elements of 2 squares on screen at the same time, makes the village feel much larger than it does in the remake. Looking at so much of the village at once and moving freely around it draws attention to the awkwardness of its layout. If you've played the original game, you'll find yourself unavoidably drawing mental squares around each part of the town just because of how obviously they were originally laid out that way. Similarly, whereas it was always apparent that the edge of the world map was just a sheer cliff at the edge of the island, seeing so much more of that cliffside and just how straight it is adds to the feeling of this world having been contrived by human ingenuity. Nintendo seems to have gone out of their way to preserve the layout, mechanics, movement speed, quest pacing, enemy placement, and everything else about the original. In fact, in certain places they even preserved the lack of overlap between water and land tiles, which I personally consider to be a huge mistake because it still looks awkward in this style. Supposing that they had started development with the intention to keep as much of the design exactly true to the original as possible while updating the graphics to look good on a modern console, I have to imagine that the main aesthetic consideration was to craft something which made some kind of realistic sense with a world that happened to be laid out in this manner. Presenting it as a playset was a creative solution, and one which I ultimately think looks great and really unique, but it also fundamentally changes the entire feel of the adventure in a way that could honestly be considered much more drastic than just shifting elements of the game world might have been. It's actually shocking just how much the remake feels like a different adventure when so little of it was really changed. Personally, having only spent enough time with the new game to get a sense of its visual alterations, I'm undecided on how I feel about the changes. I'm okay with the aesthetic being different enough to fundamentally change the feel of the game, as any new and disambiguated look was going to make it feel at least somewhat different. But if they were going to change the feel so much, then I have to wonder how necessary it was to preserve everything else about the game so stridently. The fact that item switching was preserved is particularly baffling, since the thought that they might change this is the only reason I was even looking forward to this remake. Otherwise, paying $60 just for a visual overhaul that I can't even necessarily consider a linear upgrade just seems ludicrous, and I definitely won't be doing it. Let me know if these changes felt as dramatic to you as they did to me, or if you would have preferred anything else to be changed about the game. Also, make sure to subscribe for constant videos and support me on Patreon to fund them. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.